Welcome to a splice of life science marketing, your go-to show for life science marketing professionals in biotech, medtech, and diagnostics. Join us for sharp, strategic conversations that turn cutting-edge insights into real-world marketing advantage. I'm Matt Wilkinson.
And I'm Jasmine Gray. In each episode, we'll cut through the hype and complexity with practical plays you can use to earn trust, stand out in crowded categories, and convert attention into momentum.
Hello, Jasmine.
Hi, Matt.
I'm really excited to be talking about two topics today. In this episode, we start with an uncomfortable truth. Your buyer has already decided before they ever speak with you. And from there, we look at why your field teams see problems product and marketing never hear about, and why that disconnect is now a real commercial risk. And on to our first article.
Matt, in your article, you state that by the time a buyer reaches your website looking for product information, they've already decided on the shortlist and is already building the narrative ready for procurement. Your job isn't to convince them, it's to help them justify what they've already concluded. Your latest piece cuts through the 2026 predictions to expose the execution gap that's actually deciding winners and losers in life science marketing. 68% of companies say they're optimistic about AI. However, only 7% are actually using it at scale. The pattern's identical for marketing strategy, widespread acknowledgement that something needs to change, minimal evidence of action. This isn't about tactics. It's about whether your marketing signals resilience or fragility, and whether anyone in your organization owns how buyers actually understand you. So let's get into it. What I really love about your article is this pivot from marketing being the lead generation department or marketing qualified lead department to the persuasion and alignment department. For me, that was a huge mental shift. You also open with your buyer has already decided before they contact you. That reframes the entire marketing conversation. What are teams actually getting wrong about where decisions happen, and what does that misunderstanding cost them?
Well, thank you for that. And teams still think the decision happens during the sales conversation, but it doesn't. Your buyer is building a mental shortlist long before they ever fill in a contact form or they reach out to you. They're reading Reddit or ResearchGate threads you've never known existed. They're asking colleagues in the lab or on social media. They're scanning your about page late at night, or they're actually asking ChatGPT or Claude to do all of that for them and to create a buyer's guidance summary for them. By the time they actually reach you, they're not evaluating whether to choose you or not. They're looking for evidence that confirms what they've already decided. They think of it not as persuasion, but more like defensive justification. The cost of missing this? You optimize for the pitch when you should be optimizing for the silent research phase. You create content that's persuasive in conversation, but not quotable in a procurement document. Here's the thing, if a budget holder can't copy your value proposition into a grant application or business case, you've lost before you've started. They'll choose the vendor who made it easiest to defend internally, even if your product's better. The behavior change, audit your content for quotability, not just persuasiveness.
Yeah, I love that. I think that more and more marketers, as well as the sales organization, needs to think about pulling that thread on persuasion to quotability and give the prospective buyer that language so that can help not only if you're an academic and writing a grant, but if you're part of your decision-making committee in a pharma organization.
It really is showing up more and more. AI is helping here, of course, but our buyers are becoming so much better informed that the ability for us to persuade is diminishing. And so really What we have to do is to provide evidence in formats that the whole buying group needs.
Yep, completely agree. So you talk about survivability signaling, the idea that buyers optimize for vendor stability, financial stability, not just product performance. What are the fragility signals that life science teams accidentally broadcast, and what's the fastest way to audit for them?
When you're engaged in long-term research, particularly for long-term capex, or you're looking to do research that might take many years to complete, those fragility signals are really important to watch out for. They show up in patterns that we don't really necessarily see. So aggressive discounting whispers desperation. Constant pivots of branding and messaging signal uncertainty. High turnover in customer-facing roles broadcast chaos. These aren't secrets. They travel fast through tight-knit scientific communities. Now, here's a concrete example from our LRIG research. We watched exhibitors at Drug Discovery 2025, focused entirely on, new customer acquisition, but failing on differentiation and follow-through. The booths looked identical to almost every competitor. Most exhibition floors feel like you're wading through a sea of beige. Yeah, some of the colors stand out, but everybody's doing the same thing. And those conversations that you have, most of them could come from anyone, any company. They're not saying anything differently. And then the follow-up that never arrives, or maybe it arrives, is generic. And it just forgets the conversation that you've already had. And each one of those signals that the companies aren't paying attention. So I think of survivability not as what you say, but what buyers infer from how you show up. When funding environments are constrained, buyers optimize for vendor survival, not vendor performance. So a slightly inferior product from a stable vendor beats a superior product from a company that might not exist in the next grant cycle. They need to be able to continue using those products long into the future. The fastest audit that we can do, list every customer touch point from booths, emails, LinkedIn, proposals. Ask yourself, does this signal resilience or fragility? There's no neutral. Every interaction is either building or eroding that perceived stability.
I think journey mapping is actually a good tool in this particular situation.
Absolutely. And I think it's if you can not just do journey mapping, but messaging mapping on top of that, and look at what might customers think about that rather than not just what are we saying. I think that's one of the really key things. We might be trying to close a quarter strong by doing some discounting or bringing in that sale early. But what does that really say? It says that there's a bit of desperation about the business to meet certain targets. And when we're looking at things being as uncertain as they have been in 2025 and look to continue into 2026, those signals can cause unfounded fears for our customers.
I also think that for conferences, you were talking about this sea of beige, or as Mark Schaefer calls it, sort of the pandemic of dull. I think the important word there is memorability. I think memorability in the conference presence, in the conference interaction, is also an important part of the persuasion and alignment journey.
Yeah, it's so true. And as you know, it's one of the topics we'll be talking about in our webinar with Elric later in January. But one of the things that really strikes me is that I can probably think of 2 or 3 booths from the 107 that we actually interviewed and the 200 that we walked past. And so that fact that I can only really recall 3 or 4 booths is pretty telling that actually that the memorability is low.
Right. Right. So your blog article ends with a stark choice. Marketing either redefines itself from generating demand or lead generation to orchestrate how we're understood. I really loved that phrase. I'm going to say it again. Orchestrate how we're understood, or it fragments. What does that shift look like in practice for marketing leaders heading into budgeting season right now?
I think marketing has often tried to own this, but they've often been measured on, the number of marketing qualified leads they generate. And, often marketing qualified leads are defined as some kind of interest has happened, some type of conversation, or actions have been taken on a website, or a number of actions have been taken on a website. And that's great, but that doesn't necessarily build the case for what sales need, which are people that are interested in speaking with them. But also what's really important is that knowing that even if they are interested in what you do, they might not yet be in market and ready to buy. And so we need to start defending marketing, not just on the number of marketing qualified leads we generate. And of course, bringing people in that we can talk to is always going to be important. But we need to start building the case that marketing owns how we're understood in the market. Very often people go through a big branding exercise and it's marketing that leads that naturally. The sales kind of gets rolled out to sales, it gets rolled out to a few other people, but generally it's perceived as we've changed the color, we've changed the logo and the color scheme and maybe the website. And so you're just repainting what's old. And I think what's really important is that we have to own how we're understood. Those graphical elements, while important, they really are just the coat hangers upon which we hang the emotions associated with the interactions we have across the customer journey, whether that's online through what people are saying about the business itself, or through the physical and verbal conversations that we have. Here's the thing: if we're still positioning as the team that generates leads, we're replaceable by AI tools. If we're positioned as the function that orchestrates how buyers perceive us, that's non-negotiable. So in practice, heading into budget season, you need to reframe before the conversation, not during it. Don't walk in defending spend, but walk in with a clear brand mandate, or a clear mandate for brand coherence, buyer enablement, survivability signaling, the strategic work that compounds but can't be measured in a monthly dashboard. The uncomfortable truth is that performance metrics get funded because they're defensible in a board deck. Even as returns diminish, investment in brand gets starved because it's hard to attribute, even though it's actually what differentiates and it's actually what helps us sell. One thing to do would be to draft the positioning statement for the marketing, for what marketing is for your own organization, not what you do, what you're for. If the answer is leads, you're probably in trouble. If the answer is orchestrating how buyers justify choosing us, maybe you've got a chance.
I love the concept of orchestrating how we're understood as a strategic capability. I think that's really the bullseye of how I think about marketing. What I also think about in that phrase is being laser focused on helping the potential buyer recognize their needs or their unmet needs, as well as focusing on that customer experience from the website, that customer experience in interacting during a conference, the customer experience on the phone, the customer experience in using your product, whether it's sort of at the demo phase or later on purchasing. All of that is, to me, part of orchestrating how we're understood.
I agree. And I think sadly, most marketing teams only tend to dig into that when there's a value proposition project or a brand project. And so they don't really get to spend as much time as they should be doing looking at how are we understood and how are we being understood and how is that changing over time. Mm-hmm. Too often marketing gets dragged down into the mechanics of lead generation, and with the way that AI is progressing, so many of those actions will be, can now be automated already. And as long as we're doing things in the right way with AI, you just have to orchestrate a series of agents or workflows. And that can reduce the amount of time you need to spend on creating assets and move that into the time you can actually spend on making sure that what you're doing is actually supporting how you're understood and how you're perceived.
And how you're understood is a uniquely human capability. I don't think that's something that's replaceable by AI.
I don't think so either, because there isn't that element of feeling in how you're understood. While AI can do so much to understand words and to even grasp a lot of the way that words lead to nuance of emotion, they can't ever get the grasp of how do these three colors look together? How does that make me feel? And I think that that's one of the really, really important things that marketing needs to really focus on is how are we making people feel as we move forward?
Superb. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end it on. Thanks,
Thank you.
Matt.
Thank you. Now, in your latest article, Jasmine, you argue that most life science product teams confuse talking to customers with understanding customers. They run surveys, host advisory boards, build voice of customer decks that look polished in presentations. Yet their field teams are watching workflows break down in real labs for reasons that never made it into those sanitized summaries. And so, to try and avoid that, you introduced something that you called the goose test. Now, you borrowed this from a Roman legend about sacred geese that saved the city when the official watchdog stayed silent. That to me really tells a story in itself. You mentioned that sales and field application specialist teams are shouting warnings in the notes that they're taking, that they're trying to feed back in, but often companies are waiting for feedback that comes gift wrap. And so you break down 5 diagnostic questions that expose where your organization runs on stories instead of evidence, plus the field immersion cadence that turns messy really into competitive advantage. Now, if you've ever wondered why your beautifully researched roadmap keeps colliding with what actually happens in customer labs, this should be your reality check. So you write that product teams treat contradictions from the field as noise instead of gifts. What's the real cost in your experience when teams optimize for internal persuasion instead of external learning?
So think of it this way. Non-customers are not rejections, but they're actually a gift. They represent something more like guardrails. If you can't name real people and what jobs they're doing and what pain points they have and who said no and why, you're actually designing for an imaginary average user. And I don't know about you, but I don't know any customer who wants to be considered an average user. Here's what happens. You add features to please everyone. Your pricing gets mushy because you're afraid to exclude anyone, and your roadmap becomes a democracy, which means it's sort of this spaghetti mishmash of everything and nothing at the same time. But when you can say company X or academic institution Y won't buy from us because our platform requires high throughput workflows and they run low volume fixed cell work, now you've got focus, you've got specificity. You stop debating edge cases and you price with confidence. Your messaging speaks directly to people who actually need what you built. And honestly, there's an ego here too. Teams want to believe everyone could be their customer, but that's not reality. That's not real customer centricity. That's wishful thinking. And sort of going back to your blog around persuasion, in order to focus on persuasion and carry through to alignment, you have to be laser focused on specific customers within your market, and it can't be everybody.
That's really interesting and absolutely speaks to the challenge of positioning, where you have to choose who you're for and who you're not for. Your blog also recommends that how important it is to go and spend time in the field. And you recommend that product managers should be spending at least a day in the field per month with 24-hour debrief. Walk us through what you believe that product managers should capture that transforms those observations into requirements engineering that can actually execute.
Yeah, so I want this to be every product manager's New Year's resolution. Get out there and travel with your sales and FAS colleagues at least once a month. I've worked with way too many product managers that just sort of sit in the office. They say they don't have time to get out. They'll call a salesperson when they have a question. That's not good enough. Customer language when something breaks is so important to experience firsthand and not think of it as a feature request. The exact words they use when they're frustrated is important, because customers very rarely say, I need better signal stability. What they will say instead is it worked one day, then the signal vanished after fixation. And I've been there as a bench scientist. And that frustration comes out, hopefully not in expletives, but it comes out. And hearing that firsthand is so important. That's the emotional side that every scientist has, as well as their logical side. And that makes things so much more memorable and so much more urgent. And when you write that directly into your product requirements document or PRD, now your engineering team stops debating about abstract specs and starts solving a real problem. Plus, that language becomes your launch messaging, and you're able to pull that through from true VOC into actions during the launch. Every requirement document should have at least one line per section in the customer words. It keeps your team honest. It makes it so much more memorable and relevant. And it's a great reminder of who you're actually developing and launching a product for. Here's the thing. Customers buy on emotion. The idea that we're scientists and we only work on logic, that's a Vulcan. That's not a scientist. We also have an emotional side to us, which helps to justify the logic. And you need both. So again, I implore product managers, go to the lab, travel with your sales and FAS colleagues, hear the frustration firsthand, and capture it before somebody sanitizes it into a feature request, meaning do that debrief before the 24-hour clock is over, because we tend to forget after that.
Fantastic. Now, you claim that most voice of customer is theoretical because it captures what customers say they do. And you touched on this a minute ago, not what they actually do. So what does first-hand observation reveal customer pain that surveys and advisory boards, maybe even working groups, consistently miss?
So a lot of it is first-hand observation. So ethnographic research and watching that customer do things in the lab that a customer may not articulate or remember to articulate. There's a gap in memory sometimes between what you're actually doing and what theoretically you should be doing. So watching that workflow in real time, firsthand, becomes so important. It also gives you, as a product manager, that opportunity to ask, why did you make that choice versus that choice? We had originally thought the workflow would go A, B, C, D, but you're choosing to do it as C, D, E, F. Tell me a little bit more about that. So that interaction and that observation is so critical.
It's hard not to agree with that. You know, the number of ethnographic studies I've conducted where people will say one thing, but actually they're doing something different. Those examples are really, really interesting. And it's not that the customers are lying. It's just that they actually think they're doing what they're told. But in reality they're having to use workarounds to get things to work just the way they need it. And that, I think, gives us a great opportunity for looking at product, but even if that's just instruction improvement, but also it helps us look at, actually, well, maybe there's some competitive advantage we can be gained from doing C, D, E, F rather than A, B, C, D, E. And so if we look at those things, it becomes really, really important. I think the other thing, getting to observe people in their natural habitat, is that it gives you a really good grasp of the subtlety of the messaging that's needed and how to really pull those levers. And of course, one customer visit doesn't make an entire portfolio, but if those things compound over time, those visits compound, and that insight really compounds. And if you're able to capture that, especially if you can record audio, video, get transcripts and start using that with, starting to make sense of all of that data with AI, you can actually use that through the CRM and kind of create a knowledge base that is far greater than the sum of the individual visits.
I think you're making a really important point, which a lot of product managers miss. Just because a product is launched doesn't mean your job is done and you need to move on to the next product. there's an opportunity through this observation to sharpen the message, to fine tune the pains and gains, the two sides of that messaging as the adoption curve continues.
And one of the things that we know is that as we go through the adoption curve as well, buyers' needs change, our customers' needs change. An innovator wants to play and learn and experiment with the technology and a process, whereas a laggard just wants to get it done. He wants to get the result at the end of the day. They don't really care. And so depending on the maturity of the technique and that really depends on what kind of capability do we need. All the functions that maybe an innovator wants is maybe way too much for somebody as a late majority or a laggard who actually just wants to hit a button, get the result, and say, did it give me a yes or a no?
Yeah, that it's so critical to marry that stage in the product life cycle with that messaging. And again, keep in mind who your customer is, what their job to be done is, and what their mindset is.
And it's so interesting that you say that, because innovators have such a different mindset. We just need it to work and it needs to be simple and predictable. Other times, actually we need to be innovating and push the boundaries aside by building on a stable foundation.
So true. This has been tons of fun, Matt. Thanks.
It's been a lot of fun as well. Hope you've enjoyed sort of us deconstructing and digging in a little bit to the two topics about what's changing in 2026 for marketing teams and some of the things that product marketers can do to help adapt and make sure that they're really keeping up with what their customers need.
Fantastic. Well, looking forward to having everybody listen again in the next episode of A Splice of Life Science Marketing.
Thank you for listening to A Splice of Life Science Marketing. We hope you enjoyed the episode.
If this conversation helped you, the single biggest way you can support the show is to subscribe and leave a review on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. We'd really appreciate it, and it makes a huge difference.
You can find out more about us and the topics we discuss at striven.com or on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for listening. We hope to see you next time.